Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North, and this the third part of the Jeremy Bamber arc. If you haven't listened to the first two instalments, please do so before proceeding with this one. In them I covered the lives of June and Neville Bamber, a well-respected couple who were farmers and landowners in the county of Essex. The couple, who were unable to conceive, opted to adopt, with the pair welcoming two children, Sheila and Jeremy, with the focus of the initial episodes being centred on the former. By the age of 28, Sheila had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and was receiving monthly injections of haloperidol to help manage her condition. However, in July of 1985, at her request, the doctor had halved her dose, just weeks before the tragedy at White House Farm. During that time, loved ones, friends and acquaintances had noticed some unsettling changes in her behaviour. Were these signs of her heading for a catastrophic breakdown? Join me as I delve into the events at White House Farm and the subsequent investigation. The gravel crunched beneath the wheels of the Volkswagen camper van as it trundled up Pages Lane, passing by vast fields of rapeseed, with their abundance of yellow flowers having disappeared, leaving behind sapphire stalks ripe for the harvest, dancing in the gentle breeze which emitted from the Blackwater estuary. Beyond this bountiful crop, framed by the azure sky, beckoned their destination, White House Farm. All the way from London, Colin Caffell and his 6-year-old boys Nicholas and Daniel had chatted away, singing songs and playing games. Yet as the house loomed into view, the boys became as silent as their mother, Sheila, who had spent the journey seemingly in a world of her own. Colin turned into the farmyard and parked his van between the large barn to his right and the side entrance of the home to the left. Leaping from the driver's seat, Colin assisted Daniel and Nicholas from the back of the vehicle. Grabbing their bags, they walked across the farmyard and entered through the door, into a small scullery, and on into the kitchen. Throughout the journey, Sheila had been quiet and distant, while Colin had pondered the promises he had made his family. He had reassured the twins he would speak to their grandparents about their discomfort at being made to pray, and he would inform them that Daniel was now a vegetarian. Colin had also agreed that he would speak to Sheila's parents regarding her ongoing treatment plan for her schizophrenia, hoping to address her feelings that she wasn't being heard, as she had told them she wished to change her doctor, but this had gone unheeded. Upon arriving at the farmhouse, Colin broached the concerns of his sons, which elicited a jovial response from 61-year-old Neville, joking that Daniel won't grow big and strong unless he ate meat. It was a well-meaning comment from a loving grandfather, but Colin insisted that Daniel's request be taken seriously, alongside the twins' desire that their grandmother June stopped forcing them to pray. This was a point of contention between Colin and June, with the former feeling that his mother-in-law's reliance on religion had driven a wedge between June and Sheila, and had impacted the latter negatively, with her psychotic delusions often taking on a religious tone, causing Sheila to believe that she was sinful, or perceived others as being evil. Colin had made his feelings abundantly clear in a letter he wrote to Neville following Sheila's release from a psychiatric hospital 5 months earlier. In the correspondence, Colin spoke about how the twins had settled well since residing with him, but they were finding the situation with their mother upsetting, with Colin voicing his concerns for his ex-wife, before going on to express his thoughts regarding June's behaviour towards his sons, whose perception of religion was distorted by how their mother viewed it. In the letter, Colin stated that the twins were very disillusioned about religion and put off by it since this happened. They've been most upset and have complained to me that Granny forces them to say prayers at every opportunity she has alone with them. The combination of this and witnessing their mother's religious illusions has been most traumatic for them, to say the least. Therefore, I must insist that you ask or tell Mrs. Bamber to refrain from forcing any religion on the boys in any way. If she cannot agree to this, I will have no choice but to restrict the amount of time she spends with them unsupervised. I will not allow her to fuck up the minds of my children in the way I suspect she has your daughter. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but that is restraint compared to how I really feel. This letter, however, was never sent. And now, face to face with the twins' grandfather, Colin voiced his concerns regarding June's approach to religion, with Neville assuring him that he would address the issue with his wife. Yet Colin failed to bring up the topic of Sheila's ongoing medical treatment. As evening approached on that warm August day, Colin made preparations to head back to London, having declined an offer to stay the night. As he readied himself to leave, he felt Sheila's searing stare of disappointment, as he had failed to talk to her parents about her care as promised. But he became preoccupied, as Daniel and Nicholas, his two boisterous blonde boys, embraced him. Colin recalled the moment later in his book, In Search of the Rainbow's End, in which he reminisced, "It was the most desperately strong embrace I can ever remember them giving me. They threw themselves into my arms with such force, wrapping their arms and legs around me so tightly I could hardly breathe. They were almost crying as they buried their faces in my neck. I didn't want to go. It was almost as if they knew it would be the last time we would ever see each other, and didn't want that moment to end." Reluctantly disentwined from their grasps, Colin clambered into the camper and drove away, catching sight of their two little figures growing smaller as they disappeared from view. Despite their initial reluctance to stay, people who saw the boys over the next couple of days were called two happy little children, observing them walking Crispy, the Shih Tzu, with their mother, or playing in the garden with June. One individual who observed Sheila with the children was telephone engineer Douglas Pike, who had visited the farm to fix the phones following a lightning strike. As he worked in the farmhouse kitchen, he observed the boys with their mother at the table, happily creating paper flags. This encounter was in stark contrast to the experiences of individuals who observed her actions on the 6th of August 1985. While some got a glimpse of the normal and cheerful Sheila, others saw a more unsettling side, with a number of people noting that she seemed stiff in her motions, almost zombie-like, as described by Michael Horsnell, who was painting the exterior wall at Vaulty Manor, the home of June's mother, when Sheila, June and the twins arrived at 3:15. For a while, June played in the garden with her grandsons, eliciting giggles and smiles from the boys as they raced around the grounds. Yet Sheila remained a stiff, solitary and sullen figure whose movements were limited to her knees bending as she walked. She seemed to lack any emotional response to the gleeful scene before her. Michael noted the quartet heading to the house to visit Mabel, but shortly afterwards June re-emerged from her mother's home and spoke to Michael about carrying out some work for her. However, he later recalled that the jovial June who had entered the home now seemed troubled, but whatever was on the 61-year-old's mind was never divulged to Michael. Recalling the group heading back to the car, he described Sheila's mannerisms as abnormal, and her walk being akin to a, quote, zombie from a horror movie. About 4 p.m. the quartet had returned to White House Farm, and Sheila took her sons down to the field where her brother Jeremy was harvesting. He stopped the tractor and the pair spoke for roughly 10 minutes, although he could not recollect what the conversation had entailed. Yet something about this interaction may have played on Sheila's mind, to the extent that her diary entry that night read, quote, "I didn't mean to be horrible to Jeremy." But had this been in relation to their discussion, or was this the writings of a woman whose thoughts were overwhelming her, and she contemplated all the times she perceived she had wronged her brother or treated him unkindly? Barry Parker, like Michael Horsnell, would also have an unnerving encounter with Sheila, when she, June, and the twins entered his clothing store in Tiptree just after 5 p.m. The pair had brought the twins to buy some new jeans to wear on the farm, and while June fussed over the children, Berry recalled that during the 30 minutes of them being in the shop, Sheila only spoke on a couple of occasions. Berry described her as vague and distant. She wasn't interested in the children. She struck me as a very strange woman. However, shortly after this shopping trip, the quartet stopped by the home of Elizabeth Smith, a woman who had known Sheila since the day the adopted child had arrived at the farm, and she did not notice anything untoward in her behaviour. At 6 p.m, they were all back at the farm, with June and the twins being spotted enjoying the warm August sunshine, as the boys cheerfully charged round the garden, with Crispy the dog joining in the fun. Yet by 8 o'clock that evening, the tired twosome had been bathed and dressed in pyjamas which matched except in colour, with Nicholas's being blue while his brother's was red. The twins' bedroom, located between the bathroom and an adjoining storage cupboard, which linked the room to the main bedroom, had once belonged to Sheila, and sat roughly above the kitchen. The two single beds, into which the sleepy children clambered, were positioned parallel with each other, against the wall, with a window that looked out onto the farmyard and bedside table separating them. The covers were pulled up tight about both boys, as Daniel sucked his thumb to soothe himself to sleep. With the twins settled for the night, the adults converged downstairs. Seated around the kitchen table for supper, Neville sat in his usual chair closest to the sink between the Aga, which was surrounded by a red mantle, and the door into the scullery, while Sheila was located at the opposite end with her back to a large dresser. To her right was a set of service stairs that led from the kitchen to the first floor. These were partially blocked by clutter, while to her left just after the dresser was a door to the dairy, after which was the entryway that led into the main hallway. On the opposite wall to the Aga was a large worktop that spanned the length of the kitchen, upon which was the usual household clutter, and a beige rotary phone, while behind Neville was positioned a small boiler, and the kitchen sink sat below a window looking out over the farmyard. It was while they ate that Jeremy, who had been harvesting the fields all day, entered the kitchen, with him becoming privy to the conversation being held by the trio at the table. He later disclosed to the police that they were having a serious discussion about Sheila's ongoing medical care and the twins' future, with his parents suggesting that fostering may be an option. As Jeremy stood by the sink consuming the sandwich he had made, he listened to his parents talking to Sheila, but he noticed that his sister, on the opposite side of the room from him, simply sat silently staring, seemingly indifferent about what was being said. Jeremy only got a brief glimpse of the conversation, as the light was fading and more crops still needed to be harvested and transported to the barn. Therefore he headed out to continue his work. After gathering another load, Jeremy returned to the house a couple more times, with his family remaining at the table on each occasion. On one trip to the home, he noticed some rabbits close to the barn, which prompted Jeremy to head to the den located across the scullery from the kitchen and access the gun cupboard, which was built into a recess beneath a set of stairs, from which he acquired a .22 Anschutz rifle with some ammunition. Taking the weapon into the kitchen, he proceeded to load the magazine of the gun on the long worktop where the phone was located, before heading back out through the scullery door in order to track down the pests. His plans were scuppered as he found the rabbits had scarpered. Therefore he returned to the house, removed the magazine from the gun, and left it leaning against the wooden settle in the scullery, so it was ready should he spot the rabbits again. Jeremy then went back out on the tractor, but by 9:30, with just one load left to collect, which Neville agreed he would complete, the 24-year-old bid his family good night and headed home. The sound of his silver Astra tearing through the peaceful night air as he sped off down Page's Lane drew the attention of the residents of the nearby cottages, who would later note that this was a regular occurrence whenever Jeremy left the farm. It was shortly after he had left that Barbara Wilson, the farm secretary, called to speak to Neville in regards to a bike, which she wanted to bring over for the boys, as up until that point the twins had been sharing one. Barbara volunteered to bring the bike over that night, but the response she got from her usually calm and jovial boss took her by surprise. She recalled that he was abrupt and demanded to know why she hadn't shown for work that day, despite the fact they had already agreed she would work at the site of New Malden Growers, a company partially owned by Neville. After being corrected, Neville went on to insist he would collect the bike in the morning, and the call ended without the usual politeness or charm which the 61-year-old farmer always demonstrated. Barbara felt as though she had interrupted an argument, but what had caused Neville's uncharacteristic behaviour that night remains unknown. Could he have been upset by the conversation with Sheila? Or had there been a disagreement with Jeremy regarding the harvest being finished? Whatever the cause, it would sadly be the last time Barbara spoke to her employer, the man she had grown to respect and considered a friend as well as her manager. Half an hour after this phone call, Neville would be seen on the tractor gathering the last load of rapeseed. Meanwhile, his wife and daughter were inside the farm, where the phone would be answered for the final time. It was roughly 10 o'clock when Pamela Boutflower called to speak to her sister June, but she initially spoke to Sheila in a brief exchange that consisted of her niece providing simple yes or no answers in a cold and distant manner. June took over the call, advising Pamela that Sheila, who failed to say good night to her aunt, had headed to bed. Once her daughter was out of earshot, June confided in her sibling that she was concerned for Sheila, who had been acting in a peculiar manner. Wanting her sister to judge for herself, June asked Pamela if she could see her niece, and the pair agreed they would meet up the following afternoon. With their plans made, the two sisters bid each other good night. It would be the last time anyone would hear from Sheila or June. What happened in the house after the final sightings of Neville on his tractor or June's conversation with her sister has been a source of speculation over the years. It is certain that the twins were tucked up beneath their duvets, with their blonde hair just visible as their heads rested against their pillows. Prior to heading to bed, June had set out the plates on the kitchen table ready for breakfast in the morning. She then made her way to the main bedroom, perhaps checking in on her sleeping grandchildren as she passed by their room, having washed in the bathroom. Entering the bedroom she shared with Neville, June left the sash window, located opposite the foot of the bed, slightly ajar, the open fields beyond now concealed in darkness. Dressed in her nightgown, she may have knelt beside the metal bed frame in order to say her prayers before getting beneath the bedspread, where perhaps she read verses from her Bible while waiting for Neville to join her. Relatives recall that June was a light sleeper who was easily startled by the creaks and groans of the old property, especially at night, when she would often wake Neville to investigate any noises. These relations also recalled that Neville was often the last to retire on an evening, and he had a set routine. Having finished his work for the day, he would walk the dogs in the garden, Bruce, a Labrador who was a working dog, and Crispy, June's beloved Shih Tzu. Bruce resided in the barn opposite the side door to the home, and often alerted Neville to the presence of anything or anyone moving around with a loud bark which was audible from the main bedroom that overlooked the fields at the front of the home. Meanwhile, Crispy had a more luxurious life, allowed to either sleep at the foot of June and Neville's bed or in a basket beside the warmth of the Argo in the kitchen. But just like her counterpart Bruce, she too would bark profusely when noise disturbed her, albeit in a more yappy tone. With the dogs taken care of, 61-year-old Neville would take a shower in the downstairs bathroom and change into his nightclothes before heading to relax in his comfortable armchair in the living room, with a drink and a cigar. He was known to occasionally fall asleep in this cosy setting after a long day at work, although there were signs to suggest that he too had retired to bed that night, clambering into the bed beside June, who was situated closest to the door to the landing, while Neville occupied the side beside the door which led to the box room and then on into the twins' bedroom. As the house fell silent, the night of the 6th of August 1985 drifted into the early hours of the 7th of August, and what should have been just another tranquil day in the Essex countryside would become one which would be seared into the hearts of the locals for years to come. At around 4 a.m. on that August morning, police vehicles began to appear on Pages Lane. Their arrival had been prompted by a phone call to Chelmsford Police Station from Jeremy Bamber. He advised that his father Neville had called him, frantically asserting that Sheila had gotten hold of a gun and had gone mad. But before Jeremy could gather more information, the line went dead, and subsequent attempts to return the call failed. Jeremy, who joined the police outside the farmhouse, would spend nearly 4 agonising hours waiting for news. Instructed to stay in a police car on Pages Lane, he watched as armed officers encircled his family home, and he may have heard the blows from the sledgehammer as officers forced entry at around 7:30. Stepping over the threshold from the farmyard into the side entrance of the property, they entered the dark scullery, where Jeremy said he had left the gun leaning against the wooden settle the previous night. However, there was no sign of this weapon, as the men scoped out the small, narrow space and the adjoining den located to the left-hand side, in which was the gun cupboard, located beneath a staircase. From the scullery, this staircase ascended up to another office and a storeroom on the first floor. An officer was stationed at the foot of the stairs as per procedure. Confirming the den, office and scullery were unoccupied, they proceeded through the doorway, immediately to the right of their entry point. This led into the once homely and neat kitchen. There was a sink on the right-hand side and a window through which one of the officers had reported seeing a body while they were waiting to gain entry. Initially he had identified the figure as female, yet once inside it was quickly apparent that the officer had been mistaken. Between the door through which they had entered and the Arga lay Neville Bamber, his body contorted over a fallen chair, one which in life he had often sat upon, but now his body lay awkwardly draped over it, with his head almost resting against the coal scuttle situated beside the red surround of the Arga. The 6'4", well-built farmer was riddled with injuries, suggesting he had been brutally assaulted and shot several times. During the fight for his life, it is assumed that his foot became caught in the leg of his pyjama bottoms, which may have caused him to fall over, landing in the position the 61-year-old had been found, with his trousers pulled down about his knees, and lying on the floor beside him was the broken butt of a gun. Carefully passing by Neville's deceased form, the officer scanned the rest of the room, noting the handset from the rotary phone was off the hook, beside which were strewn some shell casings. At the foot of the sink unit were 3 buckets filled with water, in which it appeared someone had been soaking laundry. These appeared to be undisturbed, yet the rest of the room showed clear signs of a struggle. The rug before the sink had been crumpled, and beneath it was found Neville's broken and bloody watch. Chairs that had once sat neatly about the table had been overturned, while the table itself, which had once occupied a central position, had been pushed across the floor until it had come to rest against the large dresser on the far side of the room. The force of this action had caused items which had been on the table, including the plates and sugar bowl, which June had laid out ready for breakfast, to fall to the floor, splintering the plates and scattering the sugar. Above the table was a light, the shade from which had been shattered, with its shards having rained down upon the floor. These now crunched beneath the feet of the officers as they made their way to the entryway located to the right-hand side of the dresser. As they had done in the scullery, an officer was left in the kitchen, posted at the foot of the service stairs, near to where Sheila had been seated the previous night, with the only remnant of her presence being her sunglasses, which remained on the table. The raid team proceeded to check out the rest of the ground floor, forcing open a door which led into the cellar, which appeared to have long been sealed by a thick layer of paint formed over it. Yet the need to be thorough prompted them to check and clear the space. After this they moved systematically through the downstairs, Clearing the shower room where Neville had prepared for bed, they then headed along the hallway, with the front door immediately ahead of them, the main staircase to the left, beyond which was the door to the dining room, which showed no signs of disturbance, with only some papers and crayons on the table being the only thing out of place in the otherwise immaculate space. Directly opposite the dining room was the smart yet welcoming living room. Neville's armchair sat beside the unlit fire, the cushions still compressed from the years of him sitting there each evening. Yet beside this and some children's toys on the floor, there was no signs of anything untoward in any of these rooms. More officers were stationed in each of these locations, as others made their way up the main staircase, attempting to silently ascend, but the aging treads creaked beneath their boots, almost betraying their approach. As they reached the 90-degree turn to the left near the top of the stairs, a mirror was used to check for signs of movement. In the reflection, the entrance to the main bedroom was visible, with the door standing ajar, revealing the presence of a figure lying motionless in the doorway. Approaching cautiously, they determined that the individual, whose back rested against the door, with her head facing towards the hallway, was June, who had a visible gunshot wound between the eyes. Her nightdress and skin were smeared with blood, and more staining on the carpet suggested she had either pulled herself or was dragged across the floor to the location where she died. Beyond her remains stood the now empty brass bedstead, with blood-stained pillows and blankets indicating that the violence may have started there. The actual events may never be fully known, but it is believed that June had been shot while in bed, with the badly injured Neville being further accosted downstairs by his assailant. It was also suspected that the trail of blood found in the main bedroom was caused by June stumbling or crawling around to the opposite side of the bed in order to reach the telephone that was usually situated on the bedside table, but this had been moved downstairs. Did she know that it had been moved, and had simply forgot in the midst of her panic? Or had the killer taken it to ensure no one could call for help? Having discovered the phone was missing, it is speculated that June attempted to leave the room, but as she reached the doorway, she was fatally shot in the head. On the opposite side of the bed from where June was found, the armed officers located another body. Lying on her back, parallel with the bed frame, her pearly white feet at the foot end and her head angled, almost resting against the bedside table. Clothed in a blue nightgown, Sheila appeared serene, almost as though she had fallen asleep where she was laid. Yet the gun resting upon her chest and the wound to her neck suggested otherwise. To the officers it seemed as though she had laid herself down to die, with a Bible on the floor beside her, perhaps the last thing she read before pulling the trigger. As the men stood silently observing the carnage around them, they became aware of a faint whimpering coming from underneath the bed, and with some gentle coaxing, the tiny, trembling Shih Tzu Crispy emerged. The poor dog's trauma was added to when she was placed in a wardrobe to prevent her from contaminating the scene. Across the landing from the main bedroom was Sheila's room, in which two beds were located. The one nearest the door was neatly made, with her belongings, a suitcase, a makeup bag and a box of tampons, laid out on the bedspread, while the other bed had the duvet pulled back, suggesting someone had been sleeping there at some point. Nothing seemed to be untoward about this room, therefore the officers moved on. Passing by the top of the main staircase, they checked a door on the right labelled Jeremy's room, but found it was locked. Just a few feet further along the landing on the left-hand side was the twins' bedroom. Nicholas was lying in the bed on the right-hand side, positioned on his back with a cuddly toy shaped like a dog lying beside him. This had once been Sheila's childhood teddy. On the adjacent bed, Daniel was curled up in the fetal position, facing the wall with his thumb still in his mouth. The bedside table located between the two beds was riddled with the usual items associated with a child's bedroom. Toys and pictures haphazardly lay, while two Mr. Men mugs had been situated in case the boys became thirsty in the night. From the doorway, the 6-year-olds looked to be sleeping peacefully, unaware of the tragedy that had unfurled around them, with a neatly folded pile of clothes positioned at the foot of each bed, undisturbed, ready for the boys to get dressed when they awoke. But as the officers drew nearer, it was apparent that they had not escaped, with both Nicholas and Daniel having been shot multiple times in the head. News of the tragedy quickly spread throughout the close-knit communities, and it was soon picked up by the press, with one of the first reports related to the case appearing in the Wolverhampton Express and Star, just hours after the bodies were found. Starting with the sensational headline of 5 shots in family bloodbath, the article proceeded by reporting that the police had classified the incident as a case of murder-suicide, with it erroneously stating, "Police believe Mrs. June Bamber killed her husband, his daughter, and 2 grandchildren before turning the gun on herself." This would be the first of many misinformed and often insensitive reports that were published in the preceding weeks. However, it was the job of Essex Police to seek out what had truly happened that night at Whitehouse Farm. The scene of the tragedy presented its own picture. 4 members of the family had been shot in a home secured from the inside. And, contrary to the Wolverhampton Express and Star's article, Sheila was found deceased, with a rifle resting upon her chest, indicating she had murdered her parents and children before taking her own life. This conclusion was supported by the testimony of the surviving son, Jeremy, who had phoned the police that morning, having been alerted by his father that Sheila had gotten hold of a gun and had gone mad. This had been the catalyst for the 3-hour-long siege prior to the armed officers entering the home. During this time, Jeremy had been outside with the police, providing them with information related to his family, the layout of the property alongside the locations and number of guns inside. The main focus was to understand more about Sheila, her mental state and capability with a firearm. Jeremy informed officers that his sister had recently been discharged from a psychiatric hospital, and may have been upset by a conversation that had occurred the previous evening. He explained he had only partially heard the discussion, as he had been back and forth from the house while carrying out the harvest. He did, however, recall that June and Neville were discussing plans for Sheila's ongoing care, and the future for Daniel and Nicholas, with it being suggested the boys may benefit from fostering. Jeremy stated that Sheila lacked any response to the conversation. She just sat and listened, leaving officers to ponder whether the thought of being separated from her children had triggered a psychotic episode. With regards to weapons, Jeremy claimed that he and his sister had grew up in a farmhouse full of guns, and they had often been shooting together, so she would have been somewhat proficient with a firearm. He also made the officers aware that she was likely in possession of a .22 Anschutz rifle, which he had inadvertently left in the scullery. He explained about the sighting of the rabbits the previous night and that he had taken the rifle from the gun cupboard in the den, loaded it in the kitchen in full sight of his family, including Sheila, and headed out to take care of the rabbits. But by the time he had returned to the yard, the creatures had dispersed without him firing a shot. Returning to the home, he recalled he had removed the magazine from the gun and left it resting against the settle in the scullery. But then he became distracted by his main task of bringing in the last load of the harvest. Jeremy concluded by stating that when he left at 9:30 that evening, his parents and sister were still in the kitchen, and Neville agreed to bring in the last of the harvest. So he drove home, but forgot to return the rifle to the gun cupboard. It was, in the eyes of the police, a straightforward case. Sheila had a history of mental illness and knew how to handle a gun. It wasn't a reach to assume that she had snapped, possibly due to the conversation overheard by Jeremy, which suggested her beloved twins would be taken from her. Fearing losing them, she grabbed the easily accessible gun, loaded it and killed her parents, perhaps fueled by anger at their suggestion she was an unfit mother and the threat of fostering the twins. And then, in an irrational state, she killed her sons, thus ensuring that no one could take them from her before turning the gun on herself. It was quickly announced to the press that the shootings had been a tragic incident, which was being treated as 4 murders and a suicide, with them not seeking anyone else in connection to it. Once photos of the scene were collected, the bodies were removed along with the gun and shell casings. Jeremy was provided with a consent form, which authorised the removal of any blood-stained or damaged items from the property. This included furniture, carpets, curtains. Having signed this, these items were removed and burned. The door, which had been damaged to allow the firearms team to enter, was replaced, and the keys were handed over to Anne Eaton, June's niece, due to the fact that Jeremy had declared he did not wish to step foot in the farmhouse, although he would reluctantly do so a couple of weeks after the tragedy. Within a couple of days of the shootings, the extended family were given access to the farm, allowing them to clean up, further removing any evidence of what occurred that terrible night. While the family grieved, they also had to contend with the legality of the situation, with questions including who would take over the tenancy of White House Farm, and who would be the beneficiaries of June and Neville's estates. Over the years, the couple had accrued shares in various businesses, owned land and properties, as well as pieces of expensive artwork and antiques, some of which had been in their respective families for generations. Amidst all the legal wrangling and the newspaper reports, many of which focused on the fact Sheila had been a model and described her as being crazy, the family were now preparing to say their final goodbyes. The funerals took place on 2 separate days. Sheila's, June and Neville's took place 9 days after the tragedy on the 16th of August 1985, with the trio being cremated following a church service attended by over 200 people. With the building full to capacity, speakers were placed outside to allow those gathered to hear the service. Amongst the mourners were Jeremy and his girlfriend Julie Mugford, accompanied by his friend Brett Collins, June's sister Pamela and her husband Robert, alongside their children Anne and David. Other family members also congregated to mark the solemn occasion, mingling with people whose lives had been touched by the Bambers, those who had shared a pint with Neville at the local pub, or sat beside June at a prayer meeting. Friends of Sheila's and employees from the farm all came together to say their final goodbyes. Also sat in the pews that day was Colin Fell, reeling from the loss of his ex-wife and his 2 sons, replaying the day he learned of their deaths in his mind. On the evening of the 6th of August 1985, Colin had begun to feel tense. It was born from his concern for his sons. This had combined with his fear for Sheila's future, knowing that the doctors had warned her condition would only get worse. As the night progressed, Colin became increasingly unsettled, and spoke to his girlfriend Heather regarding his fears, during which he calmly stated, "All these problems with Bambi, sometimes I wish she was dead." It was a comment he instantly regretted, as a feeling of dread washed over him, which he was unable to expel. In an attempt to calm Colin, Heather suggested he telephone White House Farm and speak to Nicholas and Daniel, but seeing it was almost 11 o'clock, he declined, because they were probably all asleep. He would later write in his memoir, Search for the Rainbow's End, his thoughts about this decision, stating, "I've often wondered if anyone would have answered the telephone that night had I made a call, or whether I had actually picked up telepathically on the moment of their deaths." This seeming telepathic connection may account for why the feeling of dread abruptly subsided, replaced with a sense of peace, which allowed Colin to drift off to sleep. He awoke in the morning to start a typical day of working in his art studio. Around midday he paused to have his lunch when he was interrupted by a knock on the door. Answering it, he was greeted by 2 policewomen, who inquired whether he knew Sheila Caffell. He confirmed that he did, and they advised him that his ex-wife was deceased. This was a scenario he had considered was a possibility, given her mental state, and he momentarily assumed she had chosen to take her own life. But this brief thought of acceptance was disturbed when the officers inquired if he was the father of Nicholas and Daniel Caffell. Upon stating that he was, the officers invited themselves in to deliver the news that his 6-year-old sons were also dead. In that moment his world came crashing down about him, exacerbated further when he later learned that the boys had died at the hands of their mother. Colin was always under the belief that despite her problems, Sheila's love for her children would not allow her to hurt them. But having learned that there had been discussions that night regarding fostering the twins, he began to consider that this had been the catalyst which drove her to such a desperate action. He understood that his ex-wife had a serious medical issue, and was likely not of sound mind during the attacks. But over the ensuing weeks, he would struggle to accept that a woman who was so devoted to her children would ever harm them. In an act which showed both compassion and forgiveness for Sheila, Colin refused to allow her to be parted from her sons. With the boys being laid to rest in a single coffin on the 19th of August in London, Sheila's cremated remains were placed with them, alongside the stuffed toy dog which had once belonged to her and had been found beside Nicholas that tragic night. Ever since news broke of the deaths at White House Farm, the story remained in the press, and the funerals would be no exception, with journalists and photographers positioned outside the church, following the service for June, Neville and Sheila. They captured an image of Jeremy, appearing so inconsolable he could barely stand, with him requiring the support of his friend Brett Collins and girlfriend Julie Mugford. It was an image that would be on the front page of nearly every newspaper, but would also be a picture that prompted many to question the sincerity of Jeremy's grief. From the day of the shootings there had been uncertainty regarding the accepted narrative that Sheila had been responsible, but these had been brushed aside. Join me next time as I delve into Jeremy's life and the mounting suspicions that this son, brother and uncle could be a cold-blooded killer.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.